Hello, everybody. This is Matthew Brand. Welcome to the Magnum Creed, now known as Amattus. So, formerly known as Magnum Creed, now Amattus or Amattus, however you want to say it, is A. Dot Mattis with two T's. It may sound a little weird, but the reason for the rebrand is I essentially have to accept what I want to talk about. I've kind of used Magnum Creed as an audio blog of sorts, and it's still kind of going to be that moving forward. But basically, I don't want to just simply talk about firearms and self defense. The reason I talked about that initially wasn't because I was actually part of the big firearms wave that happened in 2020. That may have been when more of my stuff and I started pushing a lot of things. But most of it was because I was actually, or am actually, a self defense trainer. I don't always brag or advocate about that or, announce it very much, but I am a self defense trainer in Metro Detroit. And usually, what I do is I kind of give safety training to people who have never really handled firearms. They're not familiar with them. They're getting into them. They're thinking about getting into them. And I give them safety training and maybe some tips on what type of firearm will be best for them. I don't tell them what type of firearm to get. I just kind of give them the pros and cons of the different uh, kinds and styles that they may be dealing with. A lot of people try to go into, I would say, blind. I would say they go into a gun store blind and they're not really sure. And then, of course, I'm not going to say of course, but a lot of firearm stores, what they'll do is they'll push something that usually is either the most popular, the most common, something they like, or something that they can sell a lot of accessories with, which I understand. It's a business. If you sell, let's say, give an example, a Glock or even maybe an M&P, there are a lot of accessories that go with Glocks and M&Ps, right? You have whole carbine style attachments that you can put onto these things. They have a lot of accessories. It's easy to sell holsters, magazines. Like they'll have those for those type of firearms. I've seen some stores that had just, I mean, they're big stores, but they had only shelves of M&Ps and Glocks. Like that's all they had in the store, except for maybe a small case where there's just a little few other things there, and everything was overpriced as well. I'm not going to say what name what store, but my point is this is a business model for some places, and if I have people around me who are interested, I like to make myself available to them as advisory. I'm not a huge gun guy. I don't collect them or anything like that, but I'm familiar. I should say you know, clean them for people. I do that, and after doing that for a while, I just say, you know what? Why don't I just go ahead and get licensed as a CPL instructor in Michigan? And that way, when people, because they have asked several times, and say, hey, do you know where I can get a class? And I'm like, yeah, and I tell them. And then, especially when the pandemic came up, it was way off when they'd be able to get a class. It was hard to squeeze in. They had to deal with all these, I don't want to say politics, but deal with delays as far as getting their license. And, you know, it made it very difficult for people. And these are people who genuinely had a variety of reasons for wanting something for self defense. They may have been single mothers or just women living alone. Some people were just getting, I had a lot of men who were just getting out of college and living on their own for the first time, and they got this nice job, but the job isn't in the area that they're familiar with, or it's in an area where it's not as savory as what they're used to. So you have people who, you have, I'm going to be honest, you have black people who are moving from the city out to the suburbs, and when they do that, they sometimes feel uncomfortable in the area they're in. Like they don't know if they're going to have problems with, in this new environment. If somebody might try something because they're of a different color, or because they're new, or because this, they have issues with neighbors. Maybe they've had issues with neighbors in the past. I've had neighbors who, they end up in these feuds with other neighbors, not trying to. It just happens over something silly, like where somebody parked their car, or I don't want to give too much away because they know who I'm talking about, because these are actual occasions. And then you have people who, they move to the city or a different city because they got a new job, or they're fresh out of college, they just got a job, and now they're moving closer to that job, but this is somewhere they're unfamiliar with and they're on their own for the first time, being, again, out of college. Some of them lived on their own, but they lived in college in the dorm. They may have roommates. They may have had a sense of community. With things after COVID being so isolating, in a way, it's even kind of scarier. And then you have all these, in Metro Detroit, these carjackings and things running rampant. It seems like there's so much less crack now, not to mention all the street racing that's going on, which you think, well, what does that have to do with self defense? Well, when things get really bad, let's say you street racing, you're running from the police, you have a lot of people who are, for whatever reason, running from the police or driving, leaving in these speed chases. They mess up one car, and then guess what they do to get another car? They carjack somebody. You have all these gas station robberies. You have constant kind of things, and then on top of that, you have the housing market becoming so expensive that young people have no semblance of a way to afford these new houses. So they're living, if they do end up moving out from their parents, they're probably living somewhere that isn't in the same marketplace as their parents. They're, downsizing, which isn't unusual, but again, they're ending up in a place where it's not as nice as what they used to be, or they're moving, like, maybe into apartment complexes, where it's a lot less safe than the giant suburban home that was in like a subdivision or whatever that they used to stay in, where they knew everybody, right? This is a different situation. I've had people I never would have thought of had knives pulled on them. There was another thing that I really wanted to talk about when I do these talks and stuff, is like stabbings and knife robberies really go underreported. And I don't just mean like police wise, I mean, it very much goes underreported. Even when it is reported to police, they don't really announce it much. You don't really see it in the news much. It is a thing that happens, and a lot of times they don't want to say that because, let's face it, if you hear, yeah, a bunch of people are getting robbed by somebody with a knife, well, then that makes people want to get a firearm. Well, if someone's going to rob me with a knife, I get a firearm. If someone's using a firearm, then, sometimes it kind of balances out. It's like, oh, they're using these crazy firearms. What chance would I have with the pea shooter that I can buy from, the local store? It's confusing. And then you get all this misinformation, like, politicians telling you to do, like, shoot shotguns in the air and stuff like that. It's weird. And, or AR-15 bullet being able to cook a deer when you shoot it, and, pulling out a 30-06 and saying that it's shot out of AR-15. You get a lot of this misinformation. So the reason I started doing what I did was because I was trying to address that for the people that were around me, and I wanted to be more certified and equipped to help them. But as time passed on, it's not that the demand went less, it actually kind of rose a bit, then kind of tapered out. But there's other things that I talk about very often. It doesn't completely revolve around firearms. Not a firearms nut. It just so happens that sometimes you have somebody in your circle who's more familiar with certain things, and that's one of the things I was more familiar with, even though I'm not big on them. I'm just more familiar with them than the people around me a lot of the times. That being said, moving on, you have other things that I talk about, such as love, such as money. A lot of times I talk about relationships, and a lot of times I talk about media and cigars and trying new alcohol. I say booze. It's not one particular. Like, I like wine. I have recently kind of got into whiskey, but I'm coming from it from a layman's perspective. So I'm not like Whiskey Tribe or Cigars Daily, where I'm, super familiar with all the different wrappers and binders that go on cigars, or the brewing processes and distilling when it comes to beers and wine, and the fermentation and all that kind of stuff. I'm not familiar with it to an extent. I am a culinarian, so I do have a certain familiarity with it. However, I do enjoy trying new things, and sometimes when I try new things, I like to talk about it. So that's what initially my original channels were about. So this was created kind of as something separate. Then I was thinking about reviewing products, but there are just so many people who are way more invested in that than me. So I just kind of wanted to leave it as an audio blog. And the brand name was to just change a lot of things. You get different types of firearms people. You get, and not just firearms, self defense people in general. For some people, they believe in it, but they don't really practice it, right? Maybe their spouse practices it, or maybe, uh, they hunt and they're Republican or right wing, and they're very strong on that stance, but they just never got into it themselves. They might have lived a country lifestyle where it was never an issue and they never conceived it being an issue. Then you have people who are all about it and they're hardcore into it, and they study and they train and they do all kinds of different stuff, or they do as much research as they can get their hands on. They like learning, and regardless of what kind of person you are, there's not much I could tell you that isn't really out there. You want to do a little something different. And then you have people who are very new into it, which are the kind of people I talk to in person. And that's the thing, I deal with them in person. And sometimes if I notice enough of something, or there's something that came up that really came into my head in class, or something along those lines, then I use this as an audio blog to talk about it. But there's so much more content I really would like to put out. Not again just to flood with content and get as much recording out there as possible. It's just as my own personal audio blog. There's way more things I like to talk about. You have people unrelated, to this whatsoever. But let's say people who like movies like Jeremy Johns, or you have people who like gaming and history and trivia and mythology, like extra credits or overly sarcastic productions, right? I think all those channels are neat. I may not always agree with them politically, but I think a lot of those channels are neat. And you have all these people; they have different things that they talk about, and sometimes they break it up, like make it a niche, and sometimes they uh, double down on what they're doing that gets the most attention, such as Just Pearly Things, who, regardless of what you think about that woman, she's really blowing up lately. Now, I personally, I'm not insulting her, I'm not roasting her, I'm not. It's not my field that I really go into, even though I will probably be talking more about relationships in the future. But my personal opinion on stuff like that is, I think that Just Pearly Things will eventually, if I'm not going to say it's going to die, like the channel's going to die or taper out, but I don't see anything good from garnering that much anger and frustration towards you. One, because it limits you later, but you got to take that risk regardless. But I really think that she says a lot of the stuff she can because it gets the views. I think she probably wants to talk about it on a typical basis, but she leans so far in one direction because it's the niche that gets the attention. The attention gets the views get the money. But on top of that, a lot of those things, you can only build up and hear the same things over and over and over again. And people kind of like it, perhaps because it's coming from a woman, maybe even a white woman, especially a white woman surrounded by a black guy. I don't know what that's about. I have no idea what the uh, deal is with that, but in which there's nothing wrong. I mean, I'm not saying you can't interracial date. That's not obviously I do. So it's not really my thing. It was just it never perhaps to me. I'd never watched enough to get the backstory on that. And again, this is a subject for something entirely different. I don't want to get stuck on this, but when you have this, that may be the little niche that garners more attention. Just like you have Fresh and Fit, right? You had these guys bringing in these Instagram chicks or whatever the case may be, and they're doing this. They're pulling them in, but over time, people was like, okay, I've heard all of these points, and now you either continue watching because you like, reaffirming what you believe, or you go and search new things. After a while, a lot of people, go on to search new things. And I, even though I could do something like that, there are other people who did it. Like they had that, what is it? I don't remember what her name was. I think it was Kate, maybe, but the AR chick, right? I don't really see her anymore. They had what was the one guy's name? I can't really remember what his name was, and I guess that's my point. But again, you have Fresh and Fit too, and I'm not saying they don't still have some level of success in what they're doing, but you notice over time things taper down, and then they keep going with the content. But something has to kind of keep going. You have to have new topics and stuff, and I don't want to fall into the ditch of reaffirming what other people believe. It only goes so far, and when you're not already somebody big or somebody who's trying to be political, I'm just trying to talk about things I enjoy. And yeah, I do. I mean, who doesn't enjoy relationships? But it is something I've always thought about. Is like the psychology of relationships, why people do different things. How can we improve relationships? How can we, um, find these relationships that we want to be so great in the first place? I never thought a couple years ago that I would find um, the kind of relationships that I had been looking for a really long time. I mean, I noticed things, honestly, like the dating market has gotten way, way worse. And it's something that um, I disdain. But at the same time, it's interesting because even though it's gotten worse, when I did find somebody, in some ways it was better, or maybe perhaps exactly what I was looking for at the time. I may have been looking for A, B, and C, and then I find A, B, and C when I finally do find it, but I find it. Where before, I was able to get way more dates, and even though the dating market was better, it was harder to find exactly what I was wanting in a partner. And it's just my current observation. I don't know what it's going to be like tomorrow, and I mean that as in the literal tomorrow, because things change and they've gotten. I mean, if you talk about dating apps, they've sank so bad. I mean, it used to be you actually talk to somebody. Then it got to where you're just swiping all the time. Now it's gotten to you can swipe a few times, and then after that they're like, "Oh, pay us now." And then I don't know, I don't pay, so I'm not really sure how it all works. But it just really sank in the quality of what's offered nowadays. I just really don't see it. Then you really don't want to date in your workplace. So if you're older and you're working, you really don't want to do that, especially if you rely on the job that you have. So then what does that really leave? And I guess to me it leaves, you can get like a secondary thing that you do, so that you can meet more people, or they say a hobby, but I mean I know they have, like, people say meetups and stuff like that. I think meetups work better when you're in the area, like let's say LA or New York, where there's a lot, and I mean a whole lot of people that you're going to run into daily. Where if you're living in states where it's just, or areas where it's not that many people, yeah, you can look at meetups all day, but you're not going to meet that many people. And then you have other situations where, let's say you create a hobby, but uh, the hobby you may have may not really introduce you to many people. Like, let's say you, for example, like going to the bar. You may not necessarily meet girls at the bar. Now you may meet dudes at the bar, and you may make friends, and those friends may have acquaintances that they could hook you up with. But a lot of the times, it's not really the greatest. I mean, honestly, people have gotten way more lonely than they used to be, even in recent years. And so, a lot of those people who are up there and doing those things, they're doing it because they don't know anybody that they will be able to hang out with otherwise. It's just the reality of it. It's the good people. If they're good, it kind of typically get snatched up really fast. And if they're bad, well, that's probably why they're on the dating apps in the first place. Not everybody, but it is something that you think about when you see it. So these are things I kind of want to talk about moving forward, and hence the name change. So uh, like this if you wouldn't mind. I also wouldn't mind to subscribe. But other than that, if you suffer through this audio blog, I know a lot of people. It's interesting. People are way more likely to listen to YouTube and podcasts instead of watching them, but it seems like they prefer podcasts and YouTube that they can see. So I'll see how this works out. Well, all you can do is really watch it. But other than that, I appreciate your time and peace.